इंडिविजुअलिस्ट मीडिया में आप जी का निੱਘਾ स्वागत है। आप देख रहे हो प्रोग्राम इंटरजन। नਵੇਂ ਸਾਲ ਦਾ ਇਹ ਸਾਡਾ ਪਹਿਲਾ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਹੈ। ਜਿਵੇਂ ਆਪ ਜੀ ਜਾਣਦੇ ਹੋ ਕਿ ਪਿਛਲੇ 2 ਸਾਲਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੋਵਿਡ ਦੌਰਾਨ ਬਹੁਤ ਸਾਰੇ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਬਹੁਤ ਮੁਸ਼ਕਲਾਂ ਆਈਆਂ। ਪਰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਮੁਸ਼ਕਲਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਵੱਡੀ ਮੁਸ਼ਕਲ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕਿ ਵਿਛੋੜਾ ਸੀ। ਬਹੁਤ ਸਾਰੇ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਈ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿਛੋੜੇ ਸਹਿ ਹੋਣਗੇ। ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਇੱਕ ਇਹੋ ਜਿਹਾ ਵਿਛੋੜਾ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਸਹਿਣਾ ਪਿਆ, ਜੋ ਕਿ ਮੇਰੇ ਫਾਦਰ, ਮੇਰੇ ਡੈਡ ਦੀ ਡੈਥ ਹੋਣ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ। ਇਹ ਵਿਛੋੜਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਹੈ, ਇਸਨੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਸਮਾਂ ਲਿਆ ਕਿ ਮੈਂ ਵਾਪਸ ਟੀਵੀ ਤੇ ਆ ਕੇ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਇਹ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਕਰਨ ਲਈ ਤਿਆਰ ਹੋਵਾਂ। ਲੇਕਿਨ ਇਹ ਵੀ ਇੱਕ ਜਰਨੀ ਹੈ ਜ਼ਿੰਦਗੀ ਦੀ, ਜਿਹੜੀ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਕਿਤੇ ਨਾ ਕਿਤੇ ਲੈਣੀ ਪਏਗੀ। ਇਹ ਜਰਨੀ ਹੈ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕਿ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਕਦੇ ਨਾ ਕਦੇ ਕਰਨੀ ਪਏਗੀ। ਲੇਕਿਨ ਜੋ ਵਿਛੋੜੇ ਦਾ ਦੁੱਖ ਹੈ, ਉਸ ਨੂੰ ਪ੍ਰੋਸੈਸ ਕਰਨ ਵਾਸਤੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਸਾਰੇ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਨੇ ਉਹ ਅਪਣਾਉਣ ਦੀ ਜ਼ਰੂਰਤ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ। ਇਸੇ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਇੱਕ ਇੰਝ ਸਮਝ ਲਓ ਕਿ ਕੁਝ ਲੰਬੀ ਬ੍ਰੇਕ ਲੈਣੀ ਪਈ, ਤਾਂ ਕਿ ਮੈਂ ਇਸ ਵਿਛੋੜੇ ਤੋਂ ਅੱਗੇ ਲੰਘ ਸਕਾਂ ਤੇ ਆਪਣੀ ਜ਼ਿੰਦਗੀ ਨੂੰ ਦੁਬਾਰਾ ਤੋਰ ਸਕਾਂ। ਸੋ ਅੱਜ ਅਸੀਂ ਹਾਜ਼ਰ ਹਾਂ ਇੱਕ ਨਵੇਂ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ, ਔਰ ਆਸ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਆਉਣ ਵਾਲਾ ਸਾਲ ਹੈ, ਇਹ ਕਿਸੇ ਨਾ ਕਿਸੇ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਆਸ, ਖੁਸ਼ਹਾਲੀ ਦੇ ਕੇ ਜਾਵੇਗਾ। ਸੋ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਅੱਜ ਦਾ ਸਾਡਾ ਟੌਪਿਕ ਹੈ, ਲੇਕਿਨ ਉਹ ਅਸੀਂ ਸ਼ਾਇਦ ਕਮਿਊਨੀਕੇਸ਼ਨ, ਜਿਸ ਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਘੱਟ ਗੱਲ ਕੀਤੀ ਹੋਵੇ, ਇਸ ਬਾਰੇ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਕਰਨ ਜਾ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ। Communication, what is it? How do we communicate? Who do we communicate with? Where? Why? We will try and answer all these questions in our show today. So welcome to InterGen, and I hope you enjoy this segment of the new year on communication. With me today to discuss this topic is Paul Randhawa. Paul is child and youth worker, and he will be discussing all the different things of communication with me. So I'd like to introduce and welcome Paul. Paul, welcome to PCHS Media, to InterGen.
Hello, Harpreet. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for creating a platform where we can try and discuss some of these ideas and see what comes out of it, and at least engage in the conversations that are meaningful and important, and sometimes we don't take enough time to attend to. Thank you so much.
Paul, thank you for being here as well. I know that we've been talking a lot about communication, and part of the communication took place, and here we are doing this show today. So let's start talking about the topic of communication, and let's start by defining what is communication.
Absolutely. So I think this is such a great back and forth we can have. Communication, I think sometimes we try to put into a box, and what is the dictionary definition of communication? I think we can all rattle off a few words that define what communication is, but until we explore individually what that communication means, until we explore culturally what that communication means, I think we'll be stuck at a standpoint. So for every individual, that communication looks different. I think there's a few components to communication. I think one of the greatest components to communication is listening. How can we listen with compassion, with empathy, and be present enough to offer the other person the same thing that we are looking for when we speak, when we communicate. So I think the second part of communication is understanding ourselves. And as we talked about earlier, understanding our communication styles and having a little bit of self-awareness to understand what makes us feel best, how do we best communicate, and how do we want it to be received. On the flip side of that, how do we offer that to somebody, the same things that we're asking for, but in a way that makes them feel heard. So I think it's so challenging. It's almost like a dance. And then when we add the cultural component to it, there's so much that goes into the bag that you're gonna have to pick it apart. But to simplify it, how can you let the person or the people in front of you know what's happening within you? You know, sometimes we almost silence the screams in our head when we're going through something, yet we stand in front of another person and we have a smile on our face. That scream in our head is very real. I think part of the conflict we face is how do we communicate the scream in our head? But we're also thinking about, is it okay to communicate this scream in my head? What is the other person going to think about me? And will they even understand what I'm trying to say right now? Is it worth it at the end of the day? I think communication, long story short, begins with self-awareness and understanding ourselves, how we would like to be understood, and how can we create room for other people to understand them as they would like to be understood.
Well, you've made a lot of good points in terms of communication. And I think the other piece that I would like to add that parts of the communication are also, as you mentioned, listening, but there are other ways that we communicate. We also communicate through our body language, right? We communicate through listening is what we're receiving from the other person, but also what we say, our tone of voice, our pitch, and all those pieces are also part of communication. So let's start by exploring listening. And you mentioned a little bit about what does it sound like? What does it feel like, right? So when somebody is giving a message, so we communicate two ways. We communicate our message out to someone, and then we also are listening to the other person. So let's talk about that in terms of what does that mean when we are talking or talking to or talking with. I think there's a difference right there as well. Because talking to, talking with, talking at, speaking, the words that we use, right? These are all part of communication. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think you nailed it. We know that most of our communication takes place in the unspoken, our body language, and even then when we are speaking, as you mentioned, our tone, our pitch. If I have mom sitting here like this, I might be saying I'm receptive to hearing what you have to say, but truth be told, my subconscious is speaking louder than my conscious, and there's some part of me that is resistant to what is coming into me, right? Versus me sitting here like this. So I think a lot of it again begins with, I'm gonna just tie this back to the self-awareness piece, just because I think once we're aware of what it is that we want to communicate and how it is we want to communicate that, I think then we have created a foundation for navigating communication, because it is so difficult, right? Because when we're in the moment, and let's say that scream in my head is constant. This morning, my anxiety is kicking in. I have some feelings that are lingering with me from the last few days over things that I'm still emotionally processing. So in those moments, am I going to be able to remember how important it is to consider my tone, to consider my hand placement, my body placement? If I'm working with a client, am I blocking an exit? Am I being mindful of these things? This is all part of that communication, that this space is open. You are free to leave at any time. I cannot be aware of any of these things and these components unless I've done the work to understand what communication looks like for me. And so I think, again, it begins with that self-awareness point. What do I need to communicate? Why do I need to communicate it? How am I going to communicate it? And the how part, I think, is when you talked about either we're speaking to somebody or we're speaking with somebody. And I think we've seen in this field of work and in our own individual relationships, it takes about a couple of seconds, I believe, if we're paying attention to realize when you're speaking with somebody and when you're speaking to somebody. To somebody feels like a natural conversation. We're not trying to win our point or maybe convince somebody right off of the bat to jump the ship and join our side of how we see things. It might be more of a conversation of, hey, this is where I'm at right now. Let me understand where you're at. Where would you like to go? Here's where I would like to go. Most often we find we're looking to go to the same place. We're just getting there different ways. And so I think once we talk these things out, we come to a common understanding. Okay, we're going to the same place. How can we support each other on our journey to get there? Oftentimes when we haven't done that piece of self-reflection and self-awareness, it's easy to, I've been guilty of this many times, just to want to share what it is that's within you. Because we don't, I think, in our society, create spaces for us to express ourselves openly and freely. Mm-hmm. And we have to take accountability for that. We have the ability to do that. We just have to learn how to do that. So once we do that, then we're also going to be a better communicator coming to the table. I'm going to be more open to hearing somebody else when I've had a chance to process what's in here and a chance to speak out what's in here. I become a better listener. I become a conversationalist rather than somebody that's trying to have my opinion heard and forced down the throat of others, right? So I think, again, coming down to that piece is how do we learn to speak with each other rather than here's my point, take it or go home, or here's my point, take it or go home.
And you hit right on the nail, because when it comes to talking with or talking to, there is a difference. And then there's a difference when we're talking at somebody. And when we're talking at somebody, that's when it's like, take it or leave it. Because this is what I have to say, and that's it, right? So that very much sounds like talking at somebody. You also touched on learning, right? Learning about how to communicate. Now, our listeners might think, well, I know how to communicate. I know what's the big deal about communication? It's talking. I'm talking. I know how to talk. But when we are talking about communication and learning about communication, can we explore on that piece as to what does that mean? Like, everybody knows how to communicate. General communication is there. We all do. That's how we get through life. That's how we go to work, we come home, we live our lives. But what is the difference between communication? Like, why are we talking about this topic today that makes it so important?
Mm-hmm. Great question. Why are we talking about this conversation? And I think that right there captures that, because on an everyday basis as human beings, I think we kind of carry a certain kind of confidence. We do communicate. We get through the day. We get through life. We communicate with people from all walks of life in all different ways, in all different languages. Sometimes, we get away with, just using body language to communicate with one another. How resilient we are to survive in so many different environments and be able to communicate. And then the other part of that, though, is that why are we sitting here talking about communication? Why have so many bridges, as we just finished speaking about, why have so many bridges been burned rather than built on this one piece of communication? And so even though we do a wonderful job and we make it through the days, there is still something that intrigues us. So there's something left for us as we pay attention in society. How often do we walk away wondering if the other person really understood us? Or, hey, that person didn't get what I was trying to say. Okay, why didn't they get what I was trying to say? Do I take accountability for any part in that? How come I wasn't able to help them understand my perspective? Right? So all of these things, I think what it comes back to is as good a job as we do at communicating, I think we've talked about this effective, timely communication And with whom are we communicating? Are we communicating with the right people at the right moments? I think that's why maybe this conversation is so important, because there is something being left. There's something from a relational aspect that it seems like as a society, as we start to incorporate more technology, and life has been changing for 2 years now, are we still valuing and prioritizing these communication skills when we get in person face to face with somebody, or we have to have a conversation over the phone, when we have to process our emotions, when we have to talk about important life decisions that involve more than one person? Can we sit down? Can we maintain our humanity? Can we communicate with confidence what it is that we would like? And can we also hear with confidence and with respect what the other person is trying to share with us? I think that's why it's so important, because it does feel like there is a gap in society that might be widening, depending on which perspective you come from, in our ability to communicate with one another and have meaningful communication, right? So again, with last 2 years, just you touched on it, there's been so much going on. When we sit down to have a conversation with somebody, are we really talking with them, or are we talking to them and at them, right? Before they've even finished their question or they've finished their thought, are we already thinking about how we're going to respond to somebody? Are we already thinking about what is our next question? Are we already starting to feel something that is starting to take our thoughts in another direction? Or can we ground ourselves for a moment and say, I'm going to hear this person fully, which is a difficult thing to do, takes much practice, and I don't think you can ever perfect it. It's a lifelong journey. Can we be conscious of making that effort? And every time we get a little bit better and we catch ourselves, oh, this person actually hasn't finished saying what they're saying, before I start thinking about the question I'm going to ask next, or before I start feeling something and start relating it to my experience, can I completely hear this person? And then can we engage? Then can I take a moment to thoughtfully respond to that? Mm-hmm. That all again begins with intention, I guess.
There's so many pieces you just touched upon, and when we're talking about communication, what you brought up is it's not just speaking and giving our message, it's also the listening of the communication, right? So all the pieces that you mentioned as to where we are we consciously sitting and listening and hearing what is being said? And then and just doing that, are we consciously doing that? Because yes, a lot of times and oftentimes we're so ready to jump into answering and responding because we think we know what the other person is going to say. But it's that skill, as you mentioned, that even if you do know what that person is going to say, maybe just sit and listen and hear what is being said, which will change your answer dramatically, change your response dramatically, change how you respond. And when even, maybe it's not the right time to answer that question. And maybe it would be a time to just walk away, maybe just listen and walk away, because that too is part of the communication. And you talked about, and I also want to talk about the voices in the head that you mentioned. Those are the voices in the head sometimes that we are already preparing our answer for the other person, even before we have had that time to absorb that question, to hear that question. And so communication is definitely a two-way street.
And how rigid does communication become? You mentioned such a wonderful point here about how sometimes we almost prepare, right? If you almost, I'm gonna liken it to, let's take it with a positive situation. If you almost imagine yourself entering a room and how you'd like to carry yourself and how you'd like to engage with people. Let's say perhaps you haven't met them in a while and you're looking forward to meeting them, and you practice and you prepare walking into that room. You're gonna take a few moments to, sometimes you stand in front of a mirror and you practice your tone, you practice your body language. Is my back straight? Is my head and my chin held up high, right? So we practice these things in those moments. But to the exact opposite. When those situations aren't in a positive light, we also practice engaging and responding to people mentally long before we've engaged them. So as you said, is that communication? It's a one-way street. And as we just touched upon, and we have fruitful communication if it's not engaging and open-ended, right? So we're already bringing preconceived notions to the table. We know how we want to feel. So that's where I think the point of self-reflection of, is that how I really want to feel? Have I spent enough time feeling this way? No, how can I communicate with myself prior to communicating with the other? Like, because you nailed it. It's, sometimes we meet people and we already know how that interaction is going to go.
Yes, and there are so many times when we say that, but in our profession, in yours and mine, as a child and youth worker, as a social service worker, right? We also talk about the person being the expert in their life. Yes. And does not matter what their mental state is, regardless of their mental state, they are the expert in their life. And if we were to listen to them, and as I work with clients, as I listen to them, it's a journey. Sometimes, even though we know the answer, right, we just have to allow them that journey and have them experience it. Because when we communicate, when we listen to what their needs are, and we walk with them on that journey and address their needs, and it's all through that communication, listening, hearing, and then doing. It takes a while. It's not, as you mentioned earlier, it's not something that can happen, quickly. It takes some time. So you're absolutely right in terms of that time piece that it will take. I want to talk about I want to bring in a little bit of a cultural perspective in here. So when we're talking about communication, there are parents and grandparents and children, and there's a lot of struggle when it comes to relationships. And earlier we were talking about how learning to communicate is really important. In today's world where we are, what are some of your thoughts on how do we learn? How do we learn to communicate? Where do we need to go? Can you share your thoughts on that?
I think it all begins with us having a little bit of humility. You made a great point, Harpreet. Sometimes we think that the wisdom of our age and experience has settled and our learning is complete. I think, as you said, this journey of learning to communicate is non-linear. We're always changing ourselves. Our communication styles perhaps will change in the course of our life. The people we engage with are always going to be different people. The communication styles are going to be different, right? So with this cultural component, the one thing that I think as a culture, perhaps as a society as well, is I think we need to humble ourselves a little bit and say that it's okay to continue to learn throughout life. And it is okay to learn from anyone and everyone, because there are teachers all around us, all different shapes, sizes, and forms. So how do we learn to take from that and apply that into our own everyday life? And we talked about communication, Harpreet. Sometimes it's as simple as being willing to sit through somebody expressing their feelings with me, right? Do I have the capacity? Let's say I'm a father of South Asian heritage. Do I have the capacity to sit there and just listen to my child when it's something that doesn't make sense to me? So we speak about mental health, and it's no longer a foreign concept within society or our community. However, it's still very much a taboo topic, and one that there is still much ignorance in our community about. And some of it is not willful, some of it is willful ignorance, right? So we have to first acknowledge that there's a lot of things happening around us. And when we talk about this intergenerational gap, right? Having parents born back home, and we are kind of a generation in the middle. And so now we're looking to learn to communicate. We're growing up in a society where communication looks radically different than the way our parents and our grandparents communicated, and even how we grew up communicating within these same households. There is a lot of nonverbal communication, I would say, that takes place within a South Asian household. There's a lot of things that are just kind of passed down and set in stone that are just to be known. Tradition is a big thing in our society. And there's a double-edged sword to tradition, right? We talk about authority. We talk about the head of the household. And what are the lines of communication within that household when we have that authority? Break it down a little bit further. Who is generally, not always, but who do we generally in a patriarchal society consider to be the head of the household, especially in South Asian culture, right? Now you generally have a man of advanced age who commands respect, whether earned or unearned. How do we, as the children, process all of our experiences within that household and find the courage and the skills to communicate what we're feeling given that generational gap, given the fact that this person, not because they don't want to understand you, but because they genuinely do not understand. There's genuinely a misunderstanding. And that's that gap, I think, that we are seeing such a struggle in communication. And I'm sure you can speak to this even more so than I can, is we're seeing a lot of conflict, a lot of internal conflict within ourselves, within, I would say, speaking for my parents' generation and my generation, we have a lot of individual internal conflict that is manifesting itself as well as external conflict. And that's because we're all feeling a lot of different things. And sometimes that confusion, the child wants to be understood. The parent wants to understand their child. They don't have the skills to communicate. That confusion becomes frustration, and that hurt becomes anger. And now we begin to communicate from our secondary emotions rather than from our truth. So how do we bridge that gap?
There's so many things you touched upon there in your conversation, Paul. You talked about expectations in communication. You talked about the generational gap. You talked about the nonverbal communication and communication our parents may have been used to. And just as soon as you said that, there are so many times I hear South Asian parents sharing an example that when we were back home or when they were back home growing up, and like, say if there was a guest who came over and all the parent had to do was communicate with their eyes, right? That's it. It was communication through the eyes or just the facial expression, like, that's all it took to say you are either not coming here or don't do that, right? So like from that to where we are today, there's a huge difference. I hear this all the time from parents that our kids don't understand. In Punjabi, they say ishara, right? Ishare naal samajh aana. So they didn't have to even say words for their kids to understand. And a lot of parents carry that communication style with them, and they expect that from their kids. Whereas, it's not the same thing anymore, because there we lived in a culture. The whole culture was that expectation was there. Here, we are taught to express ourselves through words. We are taught to express our feelings, which are of sadness, as you said, anger, or, hurt or pain. And we're not used to hearing that. So it creates that gap between not just the parent and the child, but also the generations. And I'd like you to talk about that gap. Like, how does that gap and or that lack of communication, how does it impact relationships? How can it? We know with good communication, with being open minded, with having conversations, that it can be a positive experience. But unfortunately, what we know is for vast majority of the people, it's not a positive experience. What's happening when communication is not right? What's happening to the relationships?
Mhm. And absolutely, there's something being lost in translation there from that generation to this, where we could see our parents or our grandparents' face and we would understand the unspoken, as you just said. And we've come so far to now where we are being reprimanded for not being able to operate that way and understand that way. You made an excellent point. It goes back to the entire culture was operating in a certain way. Now we've removed ourselves, our parents' generation and our grandparents' generation, and some of us, and we are taking that culture, we're trying to implant it here. And for those that have been here for a long time or born and raised here, we've learned to grow up in a very individualistic society, one that promotes individuality. And that's something that we need to learn to harness. And I think, as you said, there's something valuable in that, to be able to communicate that way. Our culture, there's a certain kind of respect. A guest comes over. There's the good in that, and there's the good in expressing and perhaps trying to understand our own individual spirit, right? So how do we merge that? And I think the issue that we're seeing, and before I say anything, I want to preface that when we talk about these things, you are not a bad parent if you do not know these things. You are not a bad parent, or you have not done wrong in your life. And, you are not to blame if there's certain situations that you look back and you reflect on and you say, wow, I could have handled that differently, or I didn't have the tools or skill set at that time to address it the way I would have liked. This is not about blaming anybody or shaming anybody. And to go back and look back and reflect and say, I could have done things differently, does not mean your experiences were wrong. It does not mean you failed your children. It does not mean you're a bad human being. It means that we all have so much to learn. We can all do differently. And we want to do differently, right? So that's why we have to first humble ourselves. Now, the second thing that comes into play is a communication through gestures. And we talk about the head of households and what our culture generally looks like in a patriarchal society, in a society where we attempt to control many things when we lack control within ourselves. I think we've been relying on obedience and authority to obedience as a tool to have our expectations met. Not just our parents' generation, our generation as well. If somebody is smaller than me, can I hit them or beat on them and try to get what I want? Yes, I can. What happens when then the next person is bigger than me? That same trick is not going to work. As a parent, when I'm much older or my child is in younger stages of development, can I rely on my presence and my role in their life to have my expectations met from my child, right? Now I'm relying on authority and obedience to that authority, which there is room for respect and respecting our elders and learning from our elders. But to say that we can solely rely on obedience to authority to get other people to live the fullest version of themselves and to live in harmony with us, there's only a certain lifeline that obedience to authority carries. And I don't know how you feel about this, but I think we often resort to authority when our toolbox, we've run out of tricks of how to get through to the other person. So how do we recalibrate? How do we stop for a second and say, you know what? My relationship with my child has been breaking down over the last couple of years. We haven't laughed like we used to for a couple of years. We haven't been able to sit down and talk like we did for the last couple of years. What is happening here? Why is this happening? Can I humble myself to say, listen, my son or daughter, or whomever it may be, can I say, listen, I want to hear what you have to say. I want to understand what it is that you're feeling, why you're going through this. And how do we not just with words, but how do we through action show that person, make them feel that everything that they bring to you will not be moralized. In our culture, often, spiritually, religiously speaking, we have a big impact in South Asian heritage. And we tend to moralize a lot of our behaviors. So then, third part of that is we role model the things that we moralize for our children. And are they going to take you seriously when they see you speaking of certain things, but perhaps not living into those things?
I think you're touching on really important points when we're talking about communication and then role modeling, right? So how do we show as a role model our communication style, our way of communicating? And you mentioned about obedience and moralizing the experiences. It really takes a willingness on the person's part to be able to acknowledge those and also realize that communication never stays same. It never should stay same because, yes, our children are our children, but how we talk to our children when they are 10 years old and how we talk to our children when they are 15-year-old is going to be completely different. And I think that's the other piece that parents need to acknowledge if we're talking about parents' experience and parents' role modeling. So the other piece that comes to my mind here is that when we're talking about role modeling for our kids, their role models have also changed. So we are not the only role models, and so I want to bring in another layer on that role modeling piece, that when we were growing up, our role models were all, again, coming from same culture, same expectations. Now for our kids, we are not the only role models anymore. They have role models in schools. They have role models in community if they're involved. They start working at young age. So they don't only have one role model anymore. They have multiple role models, right? So when we are communicating, when we as parents are talking to our kids, then our kids have alternative role models and they compare us. And I do want to say and acknowledge again that for parents to know that it's not that they're bad parents or that they don't know how to communicate or all those pieces, but it's keeping in mind that communication is you mentioned is linear, right? That it changes, it will change with time, and we need to change our communication style and way of communication with time. Because yes, if we realize that our child is starting to distance away from us, something has to change on our end, right? Because within our home, the parent is still the role model, right? So that distance and that obedience, if it's not happening, which often comes up in our culture, that our children are not they're not listening to what we're telling them, and I think at the back of the mind, it's that obedience piece, that learning that took place when parents were young. So that needs to be acknowledged. So the other piece I want to bring in, and I like us to discuss, is the breaking the cycle. So how do we move it from this point? How do we move from let's say communication that's not working to communication that is working? How do we move from that point to the next so that we can start building a relationship?
As cliche as this might sound, I think it's as simple, not as easy as, however, as simple as setting the intention. as you just mentioned, Harpreet, what kind of relationship do I want with my children? And then the reverse falls on us as young people, as children, as grandchildren. Again, we talked about communication being a two-way street, and we must take accountability as well. That, you know what, if there are certain things that a different generation doesn't have the skill set for yet, then how do we in turn role model that? Because just to step outside the bounds of community and culture for a second, the communication piece is so prevalent in all aspects of society, where we, just as human beings, have not really continued to harness this skill to communicate with one another. As the world has changed, again, we have not emphasized enough to be able to communicate with one another efficiently, timely, right? So we also have to take responsibility for that and bring that into the home, bring new skills, and figure out how to integrate those skills in the home. And it's a challenge, and it's a two-way street. And then, as you mentioned, we have the role modeling piece. And I think it comes with the intention of, if we want to tie it all together, is when we communicate, are we communicating from a place of love, or are we communicating from a place of fear? Right? And that's going to pave the path for how what we say is expressed and how what we say is heard, and more, perhaps most importantly, how what we say is felt by the person on the other end of that. So let's say we're talking about parents and a child right now. Many parents are concerned with the number of influences in our lives, and we cannot control that. Technology, at the click of a finger, we're able to see the entire world now, right? And young children are on the devices right off the bat. So I think the first thing it comes with is, am I going to choose to communicate from a place of love or from a place of fear? And if we're communicating from a place of fear, sometimes what that looks like is, I'm scared of how other people might be able to influence my child. That fear then is stemming from a place of, truthfully, how much do we believe in our capability to communicate and role model to our children? If we're that worried about the outside influences, then perhaps we need to search within to understand, how well can I communicate with my child? How can I pass along some of these values and these norms within our household, within our culture, and then greater society? Some of these morals, right? About respect, of self-respect, compassion and empathy and justice and truth. How do we pass that along? And can we pass that along if we're scared of them not having that, right? So many influences, and we're beginning from a place of expectations again. Oh, this person should be listening to me. I'm telling them what's right for them. They don't know I've been through this in my life. Absolutely correct. However, again, only the wisdom of our own experience is going to allow us to understand. So many cliches flying around us, but until we've experienced that, we can come back and say, I understand why the cliche is a cliche. As we talk about with clients, right? That journey, it needs to be done by the individual. So again, as much as parents, we know you guys know. The other part of it is that there's also a lot of other things in between that are unknown to both of us. And we need to explore those things. And there needs to be a little bit of trust. And trust is a part of communication, right? So now, how do I trust myself that I will communicate and model for my child what will serve them as a human being? And can I leave it at that? How much do my own expectations from my own life fall down to my child or my grandchild? Do I want them to be certain things or have certain things that I didn't have? Is that fair? Maybe they want them, maybe they don't. Can we sit down and then talk about these things?
And I think this point that you made about communication, where is it coming from? Is it coming from a place of love or a place of fear? If parents can acknowledge that within themselves, and that will change the way they communicate. That will, I think, that trigger, okay, if I have this fear, what do I need to address my own fear first? I hope that triggers that in parents before I communicate with my kids. The other piece that I want to switch sides a little bit as well now. We're talking about parents, we're talking about parents' experiences. I think there is also a gap between understanding from the youth's perspective the experiences of their parents, right? In every generation, parents tend to be in a sandwich
Yes.
because there are the elderly, then they're there, and their kids, and it continues every generation. The parents always are in a sandwich, right? So they
Yes.
have to understand their elderly parents, their own parents, and then they have to also understand their very different and changing lifestyle of their kids.
Yes.
I want to talk about the responsibility here of both, of course, and we've focused a lot on parents' responsibility of learning and willingness to change their communication style. But what is the kids' responsibility or kids um, that they need to understand their parents as to where they're coming from? Can we talk a little bit about that? Because I think that that will help with this whole communication piece. Because when we're listening, as we talked earlier, we have our own thoughts going on in our mind. And I think that often happens with the kids and the parents is that kids might have this assumption my parents don't know anything, they don't understand anything. And yet they don't know necessarily what their experience is because we were never taught to talk like this openly. Even this was not a situation at home. Like it was a different way of communication. It was
Yes.
everybody sat around fire, right? The grandparents and the parents and the kids, and the amount of stress was not the same, right? So there are so many things that were different in the parents' lives
Mhm.
that are different today. They've had to uproot their lifestyle and come to another country and set up a whole new life all over again. So I want us to touch on that where is the kids' responsibility in helping in that communication?
Absolutely. You nailed everything, Harpreet. Without all of those sacrifices, without all of, there's a lot of turmoil as that the generations previous have experienced back home. And as you said, trying to navigate all of these things and then coming to a new place, starting from scratch, raising children here, and then trying to give them the best foot forward within this society and raise them to be present in this society while still also trying to maintain our culture, our heritage, everything that they know. It's a loss. It's a separation for our parents as well when they've been uprooted and so rapidly their culture is what might feel like evaporating in front of their eyes, right? As we continue to progress and we have these conversations about even with the generations, our language and our traditions and our norms. How can we keep the ones that benefit us and that serve humanity? Right. So I think as much as we've spoken about the parents, it's now it's exactly it's two-way street. We are just as responsible for that communication. And the matter of fact is we've been given a platform. We are coming from a place of privilege. Right? If those lines of communication are open and we understand the history of our parents, our grandparents, of our culture, and we understand the sacrifices, then we have to consider if we have this responsibility. We've talked about how parents are always in a cycle, they're caring for their parents, they've been uprooted, and they're trying to raise children in a new world. What a responsibility. How do we understand and have compassion for the fact that they are juggling so much and they do so much in silence? And sometimes doing it in silence is not a choice. So how do we become aware of these things, and how do we become aware of all of the opportunities that we have? And when we go to express gratitude for a lot of those opportunities, who's standing at the other end of that opportunity? Yes, there is a higher power, but yes, the first faces that we see are going to be our parents, our guardians, whoever has given us that love and support in our life, whatever figures that may have been. So now, even though we've been hurt, all of us have been hurt. How do we choose to take responsibility for breaking these cycles? Because I don't know if we want to attribute any language to it, but the truth is that parents are stuck in this cycle where it's difficult to think about I design much more than the present moment, which is attending to their own parents, building a home, working a job, working multiple jobs, learning the language, and then raising children, right? How can we help offset some of that? We grew up in this culture, we grew up with this language. How can we bring that into the home and understand how much weight that the elders in our society have carried? And how do we take responsibility for wanting to lessen some of that burden? How do we take responsibility for wanting to break some of these cycles that impact us all? And we have to be willing to take responsibility. The tools, they can come with time. We have access now. We have so many platforms where we can access things. And it's going to be a matter of practice as well. Do we care enough about all the sacrifices that have been made for us to come back and do the hard work of integrating communication skills? Because the funny thing is, we realize at the end of the day that a lot of our difficulties and a lot of our emotions, though we feel them differently, it's because of a lot of the same reasons. If we feel oppressed, oftentimes we have common oppressors, right? We lose sight of that. So how can we again gain sight of that and learn to communicate and say, hey, mom or dad or grandma, grandpa, whomever it may be, aunt, uncle, teach me a little bit more about what you went through. Help me understand why you feel the ways that you feel. Here's why I'm feeling how I feel. And I think the day that, we can come together back around that table. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna tag on the last part that you said in terms of understanding and the kids' responsibility in that communication piece is that what you just said, how do I understand what you've been through, right? How do we have those conversations with our parents? And I think that what I hope is that through this program, we can build that, we can create that communication, as we mentioned, is no longer just between the parents and the child. Communication is happening all around us in many different ways. Right now, we are imparting a way of communication and influence, if you will, too. Because that is one of the things that's happening, right? The communication styles and the way of communication that I may have learned after coming here, and my kids are learning, and those who are born here from South Asian background are learning. They're getting certain influence from that communication. So we're doing the same thing. But what I'm hoping is that through this platform, we can have more of these conversations to talk about those experiences. And I think that going back to that communication and going back to that communication styles and way parents impart that understanding. So, I know that I talked about the kids taking responsibility in that piece, but I think that, again, the parents need to learn how to express their feelings of that burden and that being in the middle and their struggles, because they often do communicate that, and they will say, I've had to do this and this,
Yes.
and what do you guys have to do? right? I brought you here for a better life. But what does that look like? Right? What does that look like for the child? What is that better for the child? So sometimes parents will talk about or communicate that they didn't have the same opportunities. And I think this is where the learning comes in, that a lot of times parents feel they didn't have the opportunities that they wanted when they were growing up because they had to support their parents. But when it comes to learning, it should never stop. Whether we're talking about communication or we're talking about our own dreams. Because I think what happens is in that communication, often between parents, the struggle that I've witnessed and seen is that communication of my dreams didn't come true. I want now my dreams to come true through you. And that's not where the kids are, right? And I think that there's so many layers that we need to touch on and talk about, that how do we not as parents impose our own dreams that didn't fulfill. And it is through communication that we impose those dreams. It is through communication when we say, you know, for example, ਮੈਂ ਇੱਥੇ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਤਾਂ ਉਹ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਨਹੀਂ ਮਿਲ ਸਕੀਆਂ ਜਾਂ ਮੈਂ ਉਂਝ ਨਹੀਂ ਪੜ੍ਹ ਸਕਿਆ, ਸੋ ਤੈਨੂੰ ਪੜ੍ਹਨਾ ਪਊਗਾ, ਤੈਨੂੰ ਯੂਨੀਵਰਸਿਟੀ ਜਾਣਾ ਪਊਗਾ, right? Like those kind of conversations we hear. But at the same time, that's fine, that's okay. But how do we take our own responsibility and keep it to us and not impose it? Because that way of talking actually starts creating distance, starts creating that mental pressure on kids, that's not coming from school, that's coming from parents. And now they have those double standards, different kind of messages coming to them, right? So it all goes back to learning and willingness to learn, whether it's communication and whether it's acknowledging your own dreams and hopes. It's there again, there are layers and layers of communication. But I guess what we want to go towards is, what does good communication look like? What does it sound like? And what does it feel like? Let's talk about those three.
I could just begin by saying one thing, and I think we started this conversation by trying to define communication. And I think hearing you speak, what's so important is how can we define for ourselves the things that we're saying? We first, I think, need to understand what do we mean by when we talk about communication. When I talk about what effective communication looks like, when I talk about opportunity, I need to define as a parent what opportunity looks like. I need to hear what my child understands opportunity to mean. And then we need to co-create a definition of what that opportunity looks like, right? I just want to real briefly touch on that because you nailed it on the head with this. There's such an internal conflict right now with this generation of being given opportunity and privilege that the previous one may not have had. But we are afforded thankfully to their sacrifices. And at the same time, of being reminded of that on a constant enough basis where we become confused of how to honor that sacrifice. And what does honoring it look like? And so I think, first of all, that communication piece of what does communication look like? I think it looks like two people making a concerted effort to want to grow a relationship or to have a relationship, right? So I think first we have to come to the table and ask ourselves, do we want a relationship with one another? And do we want a healthy relationship? That's the beginning of communication in one aspect. Can we clear that up? We want to be in relation to one another. Yes, okay. Now we've defined, or we can begin to define what that relationship looks like, right? And I think it starts with co-creating definitions. Again, textbook definitions are wonderful, but when it comes to you and I and our experiences, what does that look like for us? And Okay, so now when? I just want to touch on topic of when, right? Because it's easy to sit here and say that, okay, yeah, let's talk about this. What does communication look like for you and I? Let's start to create these definitions. This all sounds beautiful. When will I have the confidence within myself or within this relationship or that comfort to bring up this conversation? Hey, can we sit down for a second and say that, you know what, our relationship for me, it hasn't been looking how perhaps I had imagined or I was hoping. And here's the reason why. I need to be able to have confidence in my communication skills. I need to be comfortable in my own skin. I need to be self-aware to be able to bring up that conversation. On the flip side of that, the other person needs to have some of these same skills and the same confidence to be receptive to that. Say, yes, you know what, you're actually right. If we pause for a moment, our relationship, maybe it's been deteriorating, or maybe there's room for it to grow somewhere and we both know it, but we haven't paused to acknowledge it. So I think communication, when we talk about these things, what is it? I think what is it falls down to the individuals within that relationship. We all know what makes us feel heard, what makes us feel good when we serve the other in a relationship, right? And so and then it comes to timing. I would love to hear some of your thoughts, Harvey, but I think one of the biggest failures of communication in our community, and especially South Asian culture, is having timely conversations with the right people. I think for a number of reasons, it's not wrong. Sometimes it's just difficult in that moment to have those conversations. But how do we start to bring ourselves to a point where we can have the courage in the moment and honor ourselves and honor our feelings, respect ourselves, respect the other person enough to think that, hey, they can handle this conversation right now. They can hear me and hold me and accept me as I am, regardless of what I'm expressing in this moment, right? That's the trust piece, the unspoken piece in communication. But I think sometimes when those moments pass for us to have those conversations, and we look back as the years go by and we say, I wish I had talked to that person at that point. Or, this was the right time to have that conversation. I think too often we let those moments pass, which could have helped build some of those bridges. Would love to hear how you feel about that as a parent yourself as well.
You know what? You couldn't have said it better. That sometimes we keep waiting for the right time. Sometimes we keep waiting for the right moment. And sometimes we don't acknowledge the time that's going by now to make that communication happen. I can share an example. When I was mourning my dad's death in the last since March 2021, in my process of mourning, one of the things that my counselor did with me was help me understand what I was mourning. It wasn't just his death. It wasn't just that he passed. It was also, I was mourning the time I now feel I missed that I didn't have with him. Things I didn't say to him, things I couldn't say to him, things that were left unsaid because of those fears that I had as a child. Or that what would my dad say? Because I didn't have the courage. Because, as you mentioned, having that conversation, do you have the confidence to have that conversation with someone to say, this is what's happening. This is what's happening in our relationship. It takes a lot of courage, not just the skill. It takes a lot of courage, especially for kids, to have a conversation with their parents, because and kids also have fear of what might happen because of the past experiences and so on. So what you just said about time is, it's so precious, because time that is gone will not and does not come back. No one has ever been able to bring it back. even we can watch movies and all that, but no one has gone in the future or in the past. Time is now. it is this moment, and it's learning to take this moment and understand that time is today, time is in the present, and time is in this moment. And in this moment, in this time, what we do with our communication is really what's going to, take us forward, whether into a positive or you know what, I'm not going to say negative direction. I'm going to say, even with our communication, when we are communicating, sometimes it is okay to acknowledge and say, you know what, this is not working.
Yes.
And we need to stop. And that too will take time, but some sort of acknowledgement has to take place, that it is not working or it's working, so that you can move towards a positive solution. So time is everything. And so is acknowledging the fact that communication will bring some sort of conclusion if it's done correctly, right? And that, I would say, is where I see in our lives, in our professional lives, we also guide others to make right decisions based on their circumstances. But it's also a lot of communication has taken place, right? So we're always trying to make positive decisions, which to others may not look positive, right? So that is important to acknowledge and know that with time, you can build, with time, you can create new. So it's everything, all the things that we talked about when we're talking about good communication. It's also, you and I talked today, we had a discussion. We also paraphrased some of each other's thoughts. We acknowledged each other's thoughts. We appreciated each other's thoughts. And this is this is a small sample of what a communication can look like. We may not agree on everything that we shared today, and that's okay. That is okay, because we are coming from different experiences. But this is what communication, I think can start. We're starting a conversation of having communication, having positive communication. So I'm hoping that all the things that you shared, and I want to know what your thoughts are. I think we're almost even beyond our time, but I do want to hear your last thoughts before we conclude this program.
Last thoughts, Harpreet. Honestly, I love the last thing you said there was, how do we start conversations about communication? And I think it's so wonderful to be able to laugh at that, but also be able to take it a little bit seriously and then look in the mirror and say, wow, we actually do need to begin with conversations about how to converse, how to communicate. And I've been so grateful for this experience every time we've been able to connect. It's been genuine discussion. I think when we sit down and have these discussions, and over time, I think communities will begin to realize too that there isn't anything to fear in opening up this can of worms, because once we begin to acknowledge that which we see but we don't speak of, once we begin to speak of these things begin to change, right? So if we want to see change, the moment we start to talk about it, it will start to change. And just one final thought, I loved how you brought up this point about creating an environment where we, once again, comes down to love and fear, right? Oftentimes, especially young children, they want to share what they're feeling. And you've shared some of your experiences, but when we're younger, for fear of what our feelings, perhaps we're already in a state of fear, then we amplify that trauma by being afraid of what it will feel like to share your fear. And to sit with that thought for a moment is really, I think, we're not in the essence of honoring ourselves because of the choice to re-traumatize ourselves and not respect our internal state. And I think we really do not respect one another when we don't leave spaces for each other to express themselves, right? So again, as parents, how can we vibrate from this frequency of love within that communication? And perhaps without even doing anything else, how can we, through our actions and through our words and how we integrate different skills, different cultures, how do we just create an environment where if somebody has something that they would like to share that's within them, that they can do so without fear? And then we can deal with whatever comes out of that afterwards. But how do we cultivate that environment? And perhaps that is something that is, sort of almost textbook or something concrete that we can work towards, is cultivating environments of love and open communication, and then leave that open to be defined as the experiences start to take place.
And Paul, thank you so much for being here and
so
having
much.
this discussion and having this conversation with me. And I'm hoping that we can be the people that our viewers can reach out to as well, because, when we're talking about communication, sometimes we need guidance, we need that support. And in our roles as you are a child and youth worker and I'm a social service worker, we help and support and guide in those conversations. And hopefully people can reach out to us. At PCHS, you can reach out to me at 905-872-3582. And if you would like to reach out to Paul, give me a shout, text, and I can always make that connection happen. I hope you enjoyed today's program about communication and how important it is to open that can of worms. This is the can of worms you want to open, because this is the can of worms that is going to start for us to understand not only ourselves, and as Paul mentioned at the beginning, it begins with us. Communication begins with self-reflection, and then we can go out and communicate with those around us, our loved ones, and communicate from that place of love. I really like what you said, Paul. So I hope that our viewers will benefit from this conversation and that you will reach out to us to have these conversations at a different level, perhaps at a different platform, and many people helping and conversing together will help us reach a goal, that is to support the youth and the parents to build relationships. Thank you so much for watching this program. Thank you, Paul, for being with me here today. And until next time, Sat Sri Akal.